She had spent her life caring for others, only to end up with nowhere to go. But just when she lost everything, a mysterious Rolls-Royce pulled up the next day, carrying news that would change her life forever. Emily Hayes sat on the curb, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as she watched her entire world fall apart. The van she had called home for the past 6 months sat in the parking lot, its doors locked, her belongings still inside. The landlord had been ruthless. No money, no second chances. She had begged for more time, explained that she was trying, really trying to get back on her feet. But it didn't matter. Not to them. Once, she had been a nurse. Once, she had a stable job, an apartment, and a life filled with purpose. But after her mother's medical bills drained her savings and she lost her job in the aftermath, everything spiraled. One bad break after another. Now, she had nothing. She wiped at her eyes, pulling her worn jacket tighter around herself. She didn't know where to go next. The city moved around her, people passing by, but no one really seeing her. Until the next morning. A black Rolls-Royce glided to a stop in front of her, its polished exterior looking completely out of place against the rundown parking lot. The back door opened and a sharply dressed man stepped out, his gaze locking onto her. Emily Hayes? She stiffened. Who's asking? The man's face remained unreadable. I have news for you, and it's going to change everything. Emily's heart pounded as she stared at the man standing in front of the luxury car that didn't belong in a place like this. He was tall, well-dressed, and looked like the kind of person who had never spent a day wondering where his next meal would come from. She tightened her grip on her jacket, her instincts screaming this had to be a mistake. "How do you know my name?" she asked cautiously. The man's expression didn't waver. "I was sent to find you," Emily frowned. "By who?" Instead of answering, he gestured toward the open car door. "Please, get in. Everything will be explained shortly." She laughed bitterly. "Right, because when a random guy in a suit asked me to get into a Rolls-Royce, I should totally do it." The man smirked slightly. "I understand your hesitation, Miss Hayes. But I assure you, this isn't a trick. You've been looking for a miracle. This might just be it." Emily's stomach twisted. She wanted to walk away. But something in his voice, certainty, confidence, maybe even sincerity, made her pause. And the truth was, she had nowhere else to go. With a deep breath, she stepped forward and slid into the plush leather seat. The man followed, closing the door behind him. As the car smoothly pulled away, Emily's fingers tightened against her worn-out jeans. "All right," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Start talking." The man pulled out a folder and handed it to her. "This will answer your questions." Emily hesitated before flipping it open, and her breath caught. Inside was a document with her name on it, and at the bottom, a signature she didn't recognize. A signature that belonged to a billionaire. She looked up sharply. "What? What is this?" The man leaned back, his expression unreadable. "It's a letter from someone very important, someone who knew you long ago, and they've left you something you never expected." Emily's hand shook as she stared at the papers in front of her. She had lost everything, but somehow, her life was about to change forever. Emily's hands trembled as she scanned the document, her heart pounding so hard she could barely focus. This had to be a mistake. Her name was printed in bold letters at the top, followed by a legal statement outlining an inheritance. A large one. She swallowed hard. I... I don't understand." Her voice wavered. "Who did this?" "I don't have any rich relatives." The man across from her watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. "A man named Richard Calloway." Emily's breath hitched. That name. It had been years. A lifetime ago. Richard Calloway had been a patient at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. He was older, wealthy, but always alone. No family, no visitors. He had suffered from a chronic illness, and she had cared for him every single day, not just as a nurse, but as a friend. Even when other staff dismissed him as just another rich man, she had sat by his bedside, listened to his stories, held his hand when he was in pain. And then, one day, he was gone. She blinked hard, trying to process. That's not possible. He passed away years ago. The man nodded. Yes, and before he died, he made sure his final wishes would be carried out. You were kind to him when no one else was. You treated him like a person, not just a patient. He paused. And he never forgot that. Emily's chest tightened painfully. She had never expected anything in return. She had only been doing what felt right. But now? What did he leave me? She whispered. The man exhaled, then slid another document toward her. Emily's eyes widened as she read the words. A house. A fully paid for home in her name. A bank account. More money than she had ever seen in her life. Enough to rebuild everything she had lost. Her throat closed. This isn't real. The man's expression softened for the first time. It's very real, Miss Hayes. And it's yours. Emily felt tears prick her eyes. She had spent years believing she was forgotten, that all her sacrifices had been for nothing, that life had chewed her up and spit her out without mercy. And yet, here she was, sitting in the back of a Rolls-Royce, holding proof that kindness still mattered. She clutched the papers to her chest, overwhelmed. I don't even know what to say. The man simply smiled. Then don't say anything yet. Just let yourself believe it. Emily let out a shaky laugh, tears slipping down her face. For the first time in a long, long time, hope wasn't just a dream. It was real, and her new life was just beginning. Emily sat in stunned silence as the luxury car glided through the city streets. This wasn't a dream. The documents in her hands were real. A house, a bank account, a second chance at life. She wiped at her damp cheeks, her mind racing. Richard Calloway had done this. The patient she had once cared for, the lonely old man who had no one, had remembered her. And now, even after his death, he had saved her. The man sitting across from her, Mr. Donovan, watched her reaction patiently. We can take you to see the house now, if you'd like. Emily let out a shaky breath. Where is it? He smiled. Not far. It's in a quiet neighborhood, close to the city but peaceful. Perfect for a fresh start. A fresh start. The word sent a shiver down her spine. She had spent so long surviving that she had forgotten what it felt like to actually live. She nodded, gripping the documents tighter. Take me there. The Rolls-Royce turned onto a long, tree-lined street, the kind she used to admire from afar. The kind where real families lived, with real homes, not vans and parking lots. And then they arrived. Emily gasped. A beautiful single-story house stood before her. White picket fence, a small garden out front, a porch with a swing. It wasn't a mansion, but it was everything she had ever wanted. Her hands trembled as she stepped out of the car. This is really mine? She whispered. Mr. Donovan nodded, handing her the keys. Yes, no mortgage, no debts. It's yours, Emily. Her chest tightened painfully. She had spent so long being unwanted, being tossed aside, struggling just to keep going. And now she was standing in front of a home that belonged to her. She took slow, careful steps up the porch, running her fingers along the wooden railing. She could already see it. A warm bed, a real kitchen. Maybe even space for her to help others. People like her, who just needed a second chance. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she turned back to Mr. Donovan. I don't know how to thank him. Mr. Donovan's expression softened. You already did. That's why you're here. Emily clutched the keys to her chest, taking a deep breath. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. Because tomorrow, she had a home, and her new life was just beginning.